Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Beneath the Surface. This lecture series is supported by Marathon. They help us to bring these all to you. We have some wonderful speakers lined up for you in February, March, and April. And I hope you'll enjoy tonight's talk. A little bit different tonight. I will be leading the talk for everyone today, and we're going to be learning a little bit about sort of the journey I've taken in small cetacean conservation. So without further ado, my name is Dave Bader, and I am I'm also the admin here, so I'm going to be admitting people. I am the Chief of Operations and Education at Marine Mammal Care Center, and I have a degree in marine biology from University of California at Santa Cruz. I also have a master's degree in biology and educational media design from University of California at Irvine. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is sort of the last 7 years of a journey that I've taken in small cetacean conservation. This journey has taken me to different places all over the world to really, for me, it's been a very formative experience in understanding the intricacies of conservation, what it takes to actually do the work of conservation with a focus on these small cetaceans, which there are so many all over the world that are in trouble, that you'll learn about tonight. So one of the things that I'd like to ask is if you have any questions during the presentation, go ahead and store those up. If you want to go ahead and put them in the chat during the presentation so you don't forget, you absolutely can do that. I'm going to talk for a little while, and then at the end, I will open it up for Q&A towards the end. We can pull those Q&As from the chat, as well as allowing you guys to unmute yourselves and ask your questions. For the presentation, I'm going to ask that everybody be muted. And without further ado, let's begin. So the journey for me started with the vaquita. The vaquita is the world's most endangered marine mammal. And my beginning here started in around 2015, 2016 with a colleague of mine who invited me to participate in sort of a thought exercise. What could we do in the next 6 months to save a single vaquita? At the time, there were about 100 vaquita left in the world. And that sort of, I knew about vaquita, I knew that they were critically endangered, but that really started my investigations into the root causes and all of the different investigations that have gone into how do we actually approach conservation, especially for something like a critically endangered cetacean. So what is a vaquita? I think that's important to know as well. Vaquita is the world's smallest cetacean, smallest whale. They're a porpoise. You can see the big red arrow there, the vaquita compared with a blue whale. They're only about 5 feet long. They're a porpoise, which is a type of toothed whale, but they belong in that same big grouping of animals. And they live in only one very small region of the upper Gulf of California. Just about 5 hours drive, depending on traffic. You could be in a space where these critically endangered animals are. Just outside of a little town called San Felipe is where the concentration of the vaquita population are today. Now, to understand the vaquita, you have to understand the situation of the space, what's going on there. And to understand the vaquita, you have to also understand the totoaba. Totoaba is a large fish that lives in the upper Gulf, and it has been fished since the turn of the century. I say up to 1975, because in 1975, the totoaba as well became an endangered species. Now, this communities of the upper Gulf, San Felipe, El Golfo de Santa Clara, Puerto Peñasco, all 3 of those communities were established as fisheries communities specifically for the totoaba at the turn of the century. Those communities, though, have developed, they've grown, they have all of the infrastructure of a community, but they've always been part of an export of some fisheries product. Initially, it was the swim bladder, buche or ma of the Totoaba. You can imagine in the early 1900s, there's no refrigerated fresh seafood coming from the upper Gulf and traveling very far. But these dried products can go all over the world. And at the time, this was a commodity that was sent to Asian markets, Chinese markets in California, in the United States, but also back in China as well. It's a shared history between the Totoaba and the vaquita. They both live in this very small space. The Totoaba's range is a little bit further, but they come into the upper Gulf to breed. And they're about the same size. You can see the picture of the Totoaba and vaquita on the left. And you can see underneath those two animals a pile of netting. Now today, the Totoaba is not legal to catch, but it's still being caught illegally for its swim bladder, which is still the same fishery that's been happening. But it's important to recognize that it's not just this illegal fishery using gill nets that's causing a decline in the vaquita population, but it's also a gill net fishery for shrimp. The Upper Gulf is sort of unique in that they use gill nets not just to catch fishes, but they also use them to catch shrimp. And all gill nets are entanglers of vaquita. And so if you read today about the vaquita and the plight of the vaquita, you'll hear a lot about the poaching and the Totoaba swim bladder, and fingers being pointed at these particular fisheries as being the culprit or the root cause or the only cause for the decline in vaquita. But the truth of the matter is that all of the fisheries in that upper Gulf, almost all of them, utilize gill nets to catch shrimp, other fin fishes, in addition to the Totoaba. Those fisheries are also part of the decline of the vaquita population. So we have to broaden our idea of the conservation in that space. Because gill nets, they're everywhere. This is a picture on the left of a Totoaba that's had its swim bladder removed, and then the net and the Totoaba discarded, thrown out into the ocean. And we can see the graph on the right. It's caused devastations to the population of the vaquita. You can see how precipitously that population has declined over time, and in more recent years, almost halving every single year. So it's a really dire situation. Only about 7 to 10 vaquita remain. And again, concentrated in this small, really small area just next to San Felipe. So what would you want? You would want to have a gill net ban. And one of the first things that happened was the president of Mexico, first things for me, president of Mexico, president of the United States at that time, it was Barack Obama, got together to talk about a lot of things, I'm sure. And one of the things was actually vaquita conservation. This is an image of a shrimp packing plant. And you can see there's really nothing going on here, completely empty. And that's because in 2015, there was an entire gill net ban for the entirety of the gill net range. And this was something as conservationists that we really celebrated. This was the answer. This was the way that we were going to save the vaquita. But in coming to San Felipe at this time, it was clear that this wasn't the whole answer, because what we saw in that space was a more or less devastated community. Up to 90% of the economy of the Upper Gulf is from fisheries, is from fishing. And in the process of fishing, if you remove all of the ways of doing that, then you're also going to remove people's livelihoods. Now, there's plenty of blame to say that there was corruption in the buyouts for the nets and all of those kinds of things. But what's really critical to understand is that eliminating this really devastating, harmful fisheries technique also led to severe consequences for that community. And because of that, the efforts to save the vaquita actually became a little bit more difficult, if it's hard to believe, in that without a way of earning a living, it sort of pushed people more towards illegality. And sort of in the void of nobody fishing, poachers could come into that space to use gill nets as well. So it became clear that it was much more complex to save the vaquita than just to establish a gill net ban. But because it was so complex, because it was so hard, one of the things that we needed to establish right off the bat was, is there a way that we can save the vaquita? We were struggling to eliminate gill nets. So is there something else that we can do? And this idea of vaquita CPR came around. This was an effort to do what we were able to do for the California condor, which was to collect the remaining few that were out there in the wild, bring them into some sort of protective sanctuary, and keep them sort of away from harm's way while we figure out the conservation problem, to solve that conservation problem. And so in 2017, we went about that. And the methodologies were sound. In the days that we were able to go out, we were able to help and catch vaquita. This is probably one of the best pictures you're ever going to see of a vaquita. They live in very murky water. They're very shy animals as well. So the techniques were sound. We were able to catch these, vaquita. But once you've caught a vaquita, you need to now have a home for it. You need a place for it to be able to live and thrive. And for us, this was El Nido, the nest. This was an offshore net pen that was meant to keep the animals in sort of their own environment, in their own waters, but at the same time provide this kind of safe sanctuary away from gill nets. This particular animal that we caught first was unable to sort of thrive. He never really settled down in the space, and because of that, she was released back into the water. It was always the plan for vaquita CPR that if we weren't able to have the animal settle down in the space, that it would be put back out into the water, and we would rethink our methodologies and try again. And on the night of November 7th, we were able to catch another vaquita. It seemingly was calming down. It was settling into the space. It was starting to navigate the net pen. It seems like this was going to be the answer. This was going to be our solution. But very dramatically and very suddenly, everything changed. That vaquita suffered for something we call capture myopathy. He had a heart attack. She had a heart attack, and she passed away. And so at that moment, our highest moment of thinking that we had this answer, that we were able to at least hit the pause button on the decline in the species, that all kind of came crashing down. And we were left with this hole. We were giving up on vaquita CPR. We were saying, this is a type of species that we're not able to bring into protected sanctuary. They just are too sensitive. And so would they suffer the same fate as the baiji? So this is another species that maybe you haven't heard of. This is the baiji river dolphin. It lived in the Yangtze River in China. And a survey in 2008 found no more baiji. They're extinct. So this is just around 10 years later, 1 decade later, and we're now in the same position of another species of small cetacean, a whale, going extinct. And we had all kinds of problems where, people just didn't even know this was happening. You maybe haven't heard of the baiji. It's a whale, it's a dolphin, it's gone extinct. You may not have heard of the vaquita before, and now it's close to extinction. So there are some serious problems happening, and we're just struggling for solutions. During vaquita CPR, this was something that I witnessed as well. This is a gentleman who was fishing with a gill net. He's setting his gill net at low tide. This is within 100 yards, a few hundred yards of the enforcement agents for the marine refuge, for the gill net ban. This was within a few hundred yards of where we were stationed for vaquita CPR. I took this picture. And right off the bat, I was angry. How could this be happening? How could somebody be setting up a gill net during a gill net ban, with this critically endangered species? But I've come to reflect on this a little bit more and recognize that this is a guy who's going about his daily life. This is how he earns a living for his family. This is how he has sustenance. This is how he, gets his paycheck. He supports some basic needs for himself and his family. And gill net fishing is the way that people fish in the upper Gulf. That this man could come to this space and gill net, it's a clear idea that we're missing something, that the connection between the communities and the conservation efforts were just really not there. Something was wrong. So now what? What are we going to do? We need to rethink our approaches to small cetacean conservation. We needed to better understand what was happening, because there's a global and emergent trend towards biodiversity loss in the ocean. Biodiversity loss, has happened on land. We know of innumerable species that have gone extinct, more that are at the brink of extinction. But in the ocean, just a few until recently. Pretty much all small coastal cetaceans, small dolphins, like the vaquita, the Irrawaddy, humpback dolphins that are in coastal Africa and Asia, all of the river dolphins, finless porpoise, both the marine type and the river type, and the popoto, or the Hector or Maui dolphin, Hector's or Maui dolphin in New Zealand, are also critically endangered. All of these animals are suffering. But we also have wedgefish. And the wedgefish is obviously, it's not a cetacean. It's a shark. It's a ray, actually. It's also critically endangered, and it's also suffering from the same challenges that these cetaceans are facing. Gill net fishing in their habitat is causing their decline. The commonality is it's long-lived and slow to reproduce species. Those are kind of the the canaries in the coal mine. These are the animals that are letting us know that there is a problem out there in the world. When we see their populations decline, when we see that biodiversity loss, it's because of their life histories. But they're only the first in that line of animals that could come next after them. So we're not just saving cetaceans because we're a marine mammal care center, we all love mammals. We're focused on this as a biodiversity issue in the ocean because of their natural history, because they're these animals that really can't handle the losses that they're seeing as bycatch in fisheries. Wedgefish are targeted, but all of these other animals, for the most part, are entangled in gill nets that are set for other things. They're set for shrimp or finfish, and then the animals are incidentally caught in those nets and drown. So there's a serious problem, and we needed to do something about it. So the first step in my journey after Mexico was to head to the booming metropolis of Heilsbronn, Germany, which is actually a small town just outside of Nuremberg, Germany. And we were in Germany because the guy leading this effort and getting us all together, his name is Lorenzo van Viersen, with Zoo Nuremberg, and head of a conservation organization called Yakupacha, which focuses on conservation efforts for cetaceans, river dolphins, and whatnot in South America. So this group of people got together to sort of better understand the broader situation and to try to think about what we might be able to do. Oh yeah, there's me, if you couldn't see me. I don't know why I was standing in the front row. But to better understand conservation and what we could do, what lessons could we learn from vaquita CPR, and how could we apply these lessons towards these other species of small cetacean. And the idea that emerged from that meeting was this thing called the IUCN One Plan approach. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. It's an international conservation organization that is behind a lot of the conservation efforts that we see all over the world. And this principle, this one plan approach, was something that was codified in work that they had gone through. And it was brought up at this meeting that this might be the way that we should move forward. Now, within the one plan approach is the idea of melding both in situ and ex situ conservation. So let's do some definitions. In situ conservation, that's in environment. It's mostly hands-off. It's really more around monitoring and regulating the ecosystems, the habitats of species that need protection. Ex situ conservation is a continuum of human interventions in conservation. So that could be anything from tagging studies to better understanding the biology and physiology of animals through drawing blood, through understanding medical care for these animals. This was all something that we needed to do a little bit better job of. The idea is that there are these different camps out there. You know, there are the in situ people and the ex situ people, and everybody goes about their own business doing their own things. And that's not working. We need to be better together in our efforts. But then there was this third part, stakeholder engagement. That was also a part of that IUCN One Plan approach, and something that will become important in putting this all together as well. So this is, you know, part of my journey is to learn about all of these things. And we learned at this meeting that there are some really amazing things happening in China for the Yangtze finless porpoise, this animal that in that same survey where they found the baiji to be extinct, they also found a very steep decline in this other species, the Yangtze finless porpoise. Only about 1,000 of these animals left. And after that 2008 survey, the Chinese conservationists really went to work in understanding all of the different things that they might be able to do to preserve this species within the Yangtze River. So we gathered in Wuhan, China in November of 2019. There I am. And yes, we were in Wuhan, China right before the pandemic. I had often thought that I was going to have to describe to people where Wuhan, China was in my talks. Obviously don't need to do that anymore. The people that we worked with the Wuhan Baiji Conservation Foundation, they all are doing all right. They did not end up catching COVID or having any serious effects from it. So that is a good side of things. So what did we see? What did we do? Well, we were there to look at you know, the Yangtze finless porpoise. What's happening in China? How are they being successful? And the things that they were doing is they found this opportunity to take this species and bring them out of the environment, out of the Yangtze River, and into these semi-natural preserves, where they could be out of the mainstream of the river, but still in this natural habitat. They lived in these oxbow lakes. So, oh, here's a video. Probably sure most of you have never seen or heard of a Yangtze finless porpoise before. So this is us on one of the reserves. You can see the porpoise in the background. They have no dorsal fins. So you're seeing just their backs, little Loch Ness Monster looking animals in the back there, and really thriving in this space. It was really incredible to see them there and to see everything that China was up to and all of the efforts that they were making. Now, these semi-natural reserves, these oxbow lakes, they were once part of the mainstream of the Yangtze River. When a river hits a flat plain, it starts to meander, starts to go back and forth like a snake, and every now and then those bends in the river will get cut off from the mainstream. The river will decide to cut a straighter course, and you get left with this horseshoe-shaped lake. And so those are kind of all along the river. But they have the ecology of the river. And so this became a really interesting and natural space for these animals to be transplanted. And a really, you know, interesting idea. And it turns out to be really well accepted by the animals. They're breeding in there. They're really doing very well. All along the river, they had these different setups of different conservation areas. They thought of as much as they could possibly think of. This is one of the oxbow reserves that they looked at as a staging area. It was still connected to the mainstream. So as a space where they might be able to bring animals, let them live in here for a little bit, and then just sort of open the gates and let them enter into the mainstream of the river on their own. If I didn't mention this before, the finless porpoise was also being entangled in gill nets and some other fishing gear in the main stem of the river. In addition to these efforts that are happening for this, managed care of the Yangtze finless porpoise, the president of China at the time, and hopefully still, has declared that there would be no fishing in the Yangtze River for 10 years, something that I think can really only happen in China. But just goes to the really amazing efforts that are being made to preserve biodiversity in this space. One of the things that I noticed while here is that when we talk about this single species, the Yangtze finless porpoise, and the efforts being made to preserve this one species, you really see the knock-on effects to how having these reserves, having these protected areas really supports biodiversity on a much broader level. When I say birds, this was really the one of the very few spaces that we were in China where I saw an abundance of birds. Even in the cities and all along the roadways in rural China, not a whole lot of wildlife, but at the reserve, teeming with life, including these endangered Piers David deer, which there are only a few hundred of in the world. The Oxbow Lake reserves being these much better thing, not just for the Yangtze finless porpoise, but also for a number of other species. And the Chinese didn't just leave it to just those simple things. They looked at providing net pens for animals. They were successful in breeding within the net pens as well, really doing as much as they possibly could, even in these more cutoff spaces. This is the Wuhan Baiji Conservation Foundation, and a pool established for breeding, actually initially for Baiji, but now being used with the Yangtze finless porpoise with some success. And just a gorgeous animal. So we learned about what could happen when you really go all in on ex situ conservation. When you put all of the tools in the tool chest, you can apply them all and you can have some great success. And this is with a species that there are only about 1,000 left in the world. So how can we then think about another species that there are many more, but are in some trouble as well? So we needed to go to Argentina to learn a little bit more about the Franciscana dolphin and the situation with them. So we went to San Clemente, Argentina, which is just south, I should say just south. It's like 3 hours south of Buenos Aires. And there I am, finally standing in the back row where I belong, probably. And really learning from the conservationists in Argentina and all the work that's being done to preserve this species, the Franciscana dolphin, which you probably want to see now. So this is the Franciscana dolphin. I say there's 20,000. There's many tens of thousands, over 10,000 of these animals, but they're vulnerable, they're declining. The Franciscana dolphin is a cousin to the river dolphins. It has sort of the same taxonomy of those animals. They're not closely related to like bottlenose dolphins or common dolphins. They're more closely related to the Amazon River dolphin, the Boto, than they are to those other species. Unfortunately, before we get to unfortunately, how would you like to see some Franciscanas? So this is some drone footage of the Franciscana dolphin. There's a little group up here, and then in the bottom right corner, you're going to see another group pop up here in just a bit. And these species, you can see them coming up right now. They specialize in living in these murky coastal waters. So they have very reduced eyes, like other river dolphins. And they have this really special difference from other whales and dolphins in that they can actually move their heads from side to side. I don't know if you didn't know this, but bottlenose dolphins and common dolphins, sort of when we think of archetypal dolphins, they really don't move their heads from side to side. They don't look left and right. But if you notice really carefully on our Franciscanas here swimming around, you can see them kind of scanning around, looking from left to right, which is just a little bit different than what you see in some of those species that we're more familiar with. But you'll also notice as the species dives, you can see how murky the water is. So this is the space that they live in. This is where they thrive. And unfortunately for them, we'll get to that, they also become entangled in gill nets. I think you probably are seeing a theme here. This technology, this amazing technology that is so efficient at catching marine life out there, unfortunately also catches things indiscriminately, and in particular cetaceans. Over 1,000 Franciscana are being lost every year. And these are sort of what's being reported. So you can see that even though there's a robust population, maybe 20,000 Franciscana that are out there, it's not going to be that way for long. And one of the things we're learning about the marine environment is this really potential for this very quick decline in species. We're sort of used to things sort of gradually going away, but in the marine environment, like with the vaquita, like with the Franciscana, they can disappear very quickly. So clearly there's a big problem. But with a little bit more time and a little bit more forethought, you can start to learn about the species, learn more about their biology, their physiology, their natural history, and you can use those to apply different conservation techniques. There's a gentleman named Randy Wells that's been working in Sarasota, Florida for a really long time. We have a Beneath the Surface talk with him as well. And he's got some great techniques that he's applied on bottlenose dolphins that are being applied now to Franciscana dolphin to better understand, one, their sort of geographic ranges. You can see a satellite tag that's happening right here. But also to draw blood from them and understand their physiology a bit better. Things that we just didn't have in place for the vaquita. No one had ever touched the vaquita prior to us going down to San Felipe when there were, I think, only 30 animals left. It was too late. In this instance, we're learning more about the animal at a time when we can use that information to make applied decisions. And Randy's been working with Leo Bernasone to help better understand these animals. But also, we learned about this organization called Aquamarina that is not just helping with understanding the biology and the physiology of animals, but also working with local fishermen to help to reduce bycatch. Working very closely with those fishermen in a certain region to put pingers on nets, to understand how they go about their fishing processes, and really not demonizing the fishermen, understanding, recognizing that their labor is not one to destroy biodiversity, but it's really to provide sustenance, to provide a way of life and a living. And there was a recognition coming now from the people that I was learning from in Argentina that there is a different approach than I was seeing in managing conservation for the vaquita. So where are we at now? Lessons learned and the future. Well, from Argentina and learning from those people, it was clear that with some new ideas, there was a different way of going about conservation that could be applied. In 2015, we went down to San Felipe on the heels of what we thought was a major conservation win, the banning of gill nets, only to find a devastated community with very little economy, and people really struggling to make ends meet. And then in 2017, seeing the communities and recognizing that there was this cultural disconnect, that the conservation was really happening by a group of people that was outside of the community, not within the community. And then everything that can happen if you really get community buy-in, and by community, this was, broadly Chinese from all different walks of life and communities, you can do some amazing things. The opportunity is there if you apply all the tools in the tool chest. And so there is these options, but there was this missing piece, and that missing piece is sort of embodied in what I learned and what I was exposed to through Aquamarina, which is we could do a better job of working with and for people. we need to think about stakeholders and how we engage stakeholders in the act of conservation. Stakeholders are those people that live in and around the species. They're everybody who has a stake in the conservation of that species. And it could be outside of the community, but it's definitely within the community. And very little work was happening on stakeholder engagement within this group of people that I was engaging with, this ex situ Auschwitz for cetacean conservation. But that all changed because we went back to Heilsbronn and we decided, there I am, to better understand how to apply this human dimensions of conservation to these small cetaceans. How can we learn about how better to engage social sciences in our conservation efforts? And it was an amazing meeting. This was just this past December. And we had presentations from conservationists in the social sciences from Argentina, Brazil, Cameroon, Colombia, Germany, Pakistan, Indonesia, Mexico, Spain, India, USA, and Venezuela. Really a global look at all of the work that was happening. And it was a lot, but it was also really interesting to see how much overlap there was when we were hearing these stories of conservation success. And they weren't with just small cetaceans. We were learning about golden lion tamarins, and we were learning about actually forestry in Germany that's been happening for over 700 years. And how working with and for people within communities can really lead to this win-win, where the community is prospering, the stakeholders are prospering, and biodiversity was being preserved. This is where the sweet spot is. Because when we think about conservation, when we reflect back on the story of the vaquita, where's our attention? The size of the pictures here is depicting sort of the scale of our attention. And we are focused in on the vaquita. We are focused in on the totoaba, the gillnet fishing, the poaching. We're less focused on the community members, the people whose livelihoods are coming from the sea and who are critically important into making the changes that we need to see to support everybody's combined outcome, because people are always going to be part of an ecosystem. You really can't box them out. You can't just omit people from the scene and say, that's how we're going to solve our conservation problems. They have to be an integral part of it because they're going to be critical for that long-term success. If we look at this as an outside approach to a problem in some foreign space, we're going to be met with failure. Stakeholders are critical for long-term success. This is their space, their communities, and their livelihoods. And so working with and for people is critical, because people are the problem, but we know that people are also the solution. This is what conservation looks like. It's sitting down at tables, it's talking to people, and it's coming up with synergistic solutions that save species like the vaquita, but also provide prosperous opportunities for local communities, because we have to reshape our ideas. It's not someone, it's not someone else's problem. It's not a Mexican problem. The vaquita is not a Mexican problem. In fact, it's always been an international problem. If you remember, the totoaba was an export fishery from the very beginning, and so is that shrimp. So it's always been an international problem, and so it's got to be an international solution. We all have to work together to solve these problems. Stakeholders have to come first. And one of the challenges that we see is conservation is often led by natural scientists, people who don't have a background in the social sciences, who working within communities with people is not what they went to school to do, to learn about. And so we have to apply a different kind of person, these social sciences conservationists, towards our conservation problems. And entering into communities right off the bat has to be something that we do, and it has to be sustained. Working with people is incredibly difficult and can be incredibly frustrating, but sustained engagement is critically important. And that last statement, working with and for people, that's sort of the sweet spot, because who are we preserving biodiversity for, if not for everyone? And so Everyone needs to prosper. And you can do this in Mexico, in San Felipe. Fishermen were engaged in moving from setting gill nets to helping the conservationists, helping the scientists to learn more about the vaquita. This was happening in San Felipe. Just the scale of it wasn't quite big enough. There is this broad view that we need to take of conservation. Now, that purple box in the bottom, that's where we've been focusing on. Sound biology, physiology, understanding the natural sciences and conservation. It's a critical component. It's a component that has to be part of our toolkit, but it's just a part. And there's just as many, if not more, parts in the social sciences that are critical to finding conservation success. And that's really what the take-home point of the meeting in Heilsbronn really brought to us. And the output, the outcome that we're hoping for is a set of criteria, a toolkit, something that we can produce that will help conservationists start to apply these social science techniques in their conservation. And with that, I want to introduce you all to a few new people. These are people that I met in Heilsbronn who are going to be giving some talks for Marine Mammal Care Center. So this is my little marketing plug. Coming up soon is Fernando Trujillo. You're going to learn about Amazon river dolphins and their conservation. He's also worked very closely within the communities. Eduardo Secchi is going to talk to us all about the Franciscana dolphin, give us a little bit more insights into their biology and their conservation, as well as I think he's going to be talking to us a little bit about the Lahil's dolphin, which is a subspecies of bottlenose dolphin recently identified off the coast of South America that is also having some critical issues. And then Yorasi Briseño is going to be talking to us also about Amazon river dolphins with a focus on the Tocuchi, which is a different type of river dolphin that you can find in the Amazon. Her lecture is maybe not going to be on the 6th, but definitely in April. And so I welcome you all to see some of the imagery in advance for Fernando Trujillo's talk on February 9th. He's a really amazing gentleman. The three that are going to be talking to us are all South American, from Brazil, and doing work in Venezuela, in Colombia, and in Brazil and Argentina. And with that, I would like to say thank you to everyone for listening to a little bit of the journey that I've taken in understanding small cetacean conservation. And I'd open this up now to any questions. And I see that we've had a few questions on the chat. So I'm going to take some chat questions. You can start to gather your questions as well. Okay. A question that came in is about MPAs. Could we establish MPAs and alternative fishing methods to gill nets? And absolutely, those two things can happen. And alternative livelihoods in general. So one of the things that we're doing right now with a group called AZA Vaquita Safe, and SAFE is an acronym, so is AZA, Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Vaquita Safe program, SAFE is Saving Animals from Extinction, lots of acronyms. We're working to support local NGOs who are working with local fishermen, so all within Mexico, to do some alternative gear trials. Some really promising alternative gear is coming out of the space. There's something called a surapera net, which catches marketable quantities of shrimp without the bycatch. So that's looking really promising. And then looking at how fishermen can shift from surapera fishing during part of the year to fishing with either long lines or traps, or diving for shellfish, things like that, to sort of round off a fishing season, a whole year, because shrimp season is that just a season. And that idea of MPAs, especially with the Franciscana dolphin, is something that could be really interesting. So an MPA could be those oxbow reserves, like we saw with the Yangtze finless porpoise, But we're learning that those Franciscana dolphins they have very small home ranges. And so MPAs could be really important in protecting and preserving biodiversity there, especially because they don't really move around all that much. Oh, a question was, how much area does the vaquita need? Well, not much. The vaquita have lived in an area. Pick your favorite small New England state. They've been living in a region about that size for millennia. They've never been a very numerous species. They've always lived sort of trapped in this upper Gulf area. So they don't need a whole lot of space. What they need is a gillnet-free environment. That is what they need. Let's see, to what extent is the vaquita also compromised by criminal gangs that are involved in illegal tobacco trade? And how do you address that? So it's a really important question. The illegality in that space is part of the complexities of all of the challenges with the vaquita. My answer to that is you need support from the community to address problems with criminality. You can't have the community be an enemy to conservation and then expect them also to help you, with these problems. Criminality is always a symptom, not a root cause, and there are broad systemic things that we need to address, not just the criminality, but livelihoods for people, diversifying the economies of the upper Gulf. These are things that need to be invested in the long term. I think that if you were to see that in the upper Gulf, that if you were to give people options, legal options for employment, you would see a decline in criminality in the space. But that's just a theory. Let's see, what examples of support for community science and stakeholder communities can you share? So we learned a lot from a lot of different people. I think one of the really amazing things we learned about was beekeeping in Africa. There was these regions of Africa where an investment was made in communities to start to grow honey from bees. That the forest around them was critical to maintain the bees. So the beehives were placed out in the forest, and now the forest is being protected by the community and all of the biodiversity within that forest to manage and maintain this really important part of the central economy now for this community. So what does that have to do with social sciences? Well, economics is a social science. Community work, getting in with those community members to start to establish a new market. That required working with and for people to establish this new way of making a living that's not extractive, or at least not extractive in the typical sense, and created a value around the resource, which was the forest that wanted to be protected. So I hope that's a good example for you. I think I answered the MPA question. Oh, fishing seasons so that the vaquita can thrive and have some relief from gillnets. Unfortunately, there are seasons for different kinds of things in the upper Gulf. All of those seasons involve gillnets. So the seasons for shrimp, they're caught with gillnets. The season for Sierra, other species, they also use gillnets in the space. So it's really method of capture that needs to change in that space. Let's see. Is there anything like that happening in Long Beach? Need a little bit more help with understanding that question. If you can add a little more detail, we can do that. Are there lessons that we can learn from conservation efforts in China that we can apply to rivers and waterways in the USA? Yeah, absolutely. I think the Chinese really have taken a holistic approach, and that's a top-down approach that I would generally not be in favor of in most instances. But that top-down approach also involved community members. It involved building they hosted a lot of community events around the biodiversity of the Yangtze River, so that helping people to understand why the gillnet ban was in place, why the fisheries ban was in place, and really working to garner public support for what was publicly being called, the critical natural resource of China. And the Chinese at the highest level of government looking at biodiversity as an important and critical part of what they want to see from their societies, which I think that could be applied here in the United States. Is there anything that we can join to help? Absolutely. You can definitely help us out with Vaquita Safe, following Vaquita Safe on social media, and also following our partner organizations, Museo de la Ballena, which is a Mexican organization, and Pesca ABC. I'll type those into the chat if you hang out towards the end. Those are our two really incredible Mexican NGOs that are doing a lot of great conservation work. So support and following and learning more from those organizations, I think, could be really helpful. How would you suggest getting involved in marine conservation? I have an environmental engineering background. And there's some roadblocks and steps towards careers in conservation. You know, I think starting with a passion, it sounds like you have it, is the most important thing. And I truly believe there is a job for everybody in this space. You don't have to be a marine biologist. And I think approaching the work that you want to do with that passion is the first step. And then keep at it, because those jobs do exist in all sorts of spaces. There's jobs in technology that's required. There's jobs in social media. One of the critical things that we're supporting Pesca ABC with through AZA Vaquita Safe is helping to manage and run their social media. They have a very small NGO with very low capacity. So there are things that we can give to support these broader efforts. How is this work being funded? Mostly through individuals, through NGOs. I think that question of funding is really important, and not something that we've really cracked the nut on. For our work in vaquita conservation, we're able to raise around $30,000 a year to support those local NGOs. But I think we need we need orders of magnitude more funding and support to really get things off the ground there. And that's been a huge challenge for us, I have to say. And the question was, are there really only 7 vaquita left? There are only 7 vaquita left. The good news is those 7 vaquita seem to be what we say is very net savvy. They seem to be the animals that are able to avoid being entangled. The challenge is that it's really just a matter of time. So really doubling down on our efforts within the space to support these efforts in alternative gear is one of the really important things that we need to work on. But because we started so late, because so much community trust has been eroded in that space, it's become ever more difficult for us to really apply a lot of these lessons learned in that particular space. Oh, have citizen scientists made any new or interesting discoveries through this work? Vanessa, that's a wonderful thing. Citizen science is a really important aspect of so many different conservation projects. Nothing that I know of in small cetaceans, but certainly that idea of engaging your communities, your citizens in the act of taking scientific data is an approach that can support conservation. I think one of the really neat examples, again, of including working with and for people towards conservation success, something that you might look up, are the black mambas in Africa. They're an all-female, unarmed conservation group that monitors a national park down there that has a number of different species, including rhinos. And these women have reduced poaching by over 80% in the spaces that they work. But not only are they really fantastically capable of managing and convincing these poachers from not jumping the fence, from not entering into the park to do their work, but they're finding that with education programs connected with these amazing women, you're starting to see lots of really important movement in community buy-in for that conservation effort as well. So, having these really invested alternative livelihoods for people, not just is a space to provide new employment for people, which is really important, but if you combine that with education, you can start to see these community-wide effects, which is an emergent idea, but something that's really, really important. Okay, I think I got to everybody's questions. I want to thank everybody so much for joining me here tonight. That's my email up there on the screen. If you have any further questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Really appreciate you joining me tonight, and I hope you learned a little bit more. And I would, do we have a last questions? Oh, links to the social media. I'm going to type in the names of them, not the links, because I was not on top of it enough, but it's Pesca ABC and Museo de la Ballena. So if you look up those two organizations, they have some really cool work. Hopefully you'll be able to find them on Facebook, Instagram, all of that kind of stuff. We work most closely with Pesca ABC. So I see all the thank yous. Thanks everybody for joining me here tonight. And I hope to see you all again in February with Fernando Trujillo.